2023 steelhead season is a wrap, and it was an incredible year heading back to some water I've guided over the years and taking advantage of all of the turn of the seasons had to offer. I began my season in mid-September, knowing that I would likely not encounter many fish, but I would also encounter very few crowds. The weather in the early season is incredible, and with few people out on the water, you virtually have these spots to yourself, and it was incredible to get up there at one of my favorite times of the year. I covered some ground and tried to find some fish, but as expected, there were not too many early fish in on 12, 16, or 20 mile creeks. So with that in mind, I decided I'd head over to New York and try my luck on those streams there. I found a few fish held under the bridge by the mouth of Canadaway Creek, and I also scouted the Cattaraugus Creek where I'd heard rumors of king salmon. A quick beef on wax sandwich in Fredonia, and I met my cousin Chad back under the bridge in Canadaway Creek for a quick fishing session. The day ended with nothing more than a bite under the bridge, but watching the sunset over Lake Erie was a great end to the day. I headed back to Pennsylvania, and I had a little bit more light, so I headed back to 20 Mile Creek to try my luck. Ultimately, the night session wouldn't really get it done, but in the morning I would have the first success of my trip. After some patience, a stubborn steelhead took my stonefly as I drifted it past the log it was hiding under. The first success of the season, and it felt good to end on a high note. With one fish to net, I decided I'd head back home. I checked out the hatchery at Trout Run, and then went over to Walnut Creek to see what the crowds looked like there. Some crowds had developed over the few fish that had already pushed in, and there was a full-on crowd stacked up on the wall at Walnut. It would be a few weeks before I would make my next trip up, starting at the beginning of October and taking advantage of reports of a few more fish that had pushed into the Erie tribs. I had the bottleneck on 12 Mile Creek to myself and got into a 30-minute fight. This was my first time attempting to tight line for steelhead on my 3-weight Hardy Euro rod. I was fishing a Coffee Pat's rubber leg, and this was maybe my third cast into hitting the spot, and it hooked into a really good fish. It took me on a good run up the shale, and I tried my best to get this one to net. Ultimately, due to low and clear conditions, I was fishing on lighter tippet than I usually would, and the 3-weight Euro rod was offering me perfect tippet protection. With a 10-foot 8 reach, this rod incorporates all its length, giving me the fighting section similar to a 7-weight, allowing me to enable this 30-minute fight to continue. However, the fish had other plans and decided to make a long run up under the concrete tube there. This would inevitably spell the end of the fight. I had to shake off the first fish because the action was only going to heat up throughout the day. After scouting a bit in the surf, I headed back up to the bottleneck for a bit of redemption. It didn't take long to hook into another steelhead, this time fishing a small nymph called a black death. Not the biggest steelhead, but we were on the board for the trip. I headed back to 20 Mile Creek, and was quickly greeted by a few fish at some of my familiar spots. While they were extremely elusive in the low clear conditions, I was ultimately able to find some success. I got into an aggressive fight, with this fish going airborne a few times and making several long runs, pushing the hardy in my old Cabela's reel to the limit. But ultimately, I was able to bring this one in. At a well-known spot directly beneath Interstate 90, I got into another steelhead drifting a stonefly up underneath that log jam. It felt good to bring this fish to net after such a tough fight. With some success away from the crowds up on Upper 20 Mile Creek, I headed down to the mouth to check out what I called the circus. And sure enough, crowds had developed. This very much is an Instagram versus reality type situation, as you'll be faced with gorgeous scenery of Lake Erie coastline, and if you turn your head, you'll see just a stacked up pod of anglers over a large group of steelhead. There were some less than ethical practices being employed, so I decided to pack it up and hit the road. I made my way to New York and stopped at one of my favorite creeks, Canada Way Creek in Fredonia, New York, where I caught my first ever steelhead. I quickly hooked up on the trusty Coffee Pat's rubber leg and got into another aggressive fight. After some success at Canada Way Creek, I decided I'd head back to PA and check out the crowds on 16 Mile. To my surprise, there wasn't a single car in the parking lot, so I decided I'd head up to one of the most popular spots in the Erie area. Well, the fish were stacked up, so were the leaves, and that made for some challenging fishing. I did get into some quick fights, like this one here, which was over in about 5 seconds after I turned the camera on. And ultimately, with the leaves and light going down fast, I had to make the most of this opportunity to fish 16 Mile with no crowds. I made it back to 12 Mile Creek in the morning and met some folks from Philly who helped me out with a little bit of the netting of some of these aggressive fish that we got into at the mouth. Session with the Philly folks made the trip end on a high note, and it would be a few more weeks before I would head back up north with words of more fresh fish that had pushed in after some heavy rains. It's not a big one, but I'm on bugger. I think I'll be able to get this one in. Well, not the prettiest of all steelhead, it was one in the bag, and I headed downstream to see what some of the spots down lower looked like. I encountered some folks on my journey downstream, and ultimately found one of my favorite spots absolutely loaded with fish waiting on rain to move on upstream. These fish gave me long fights as they continued to run up and back of this roughly 200-foot long channel, and it made for some challenging netting. My hardy Euro stick did its job as a big buck screamed the drag, making several runs. This was my biggest steelhead of the season so far, and it felt great to get it to net. After a few good fights, I headed back upstream and over to 12 Mile Creek, where I quickly got into another fight with a good brown trout.
He might come to you right there. I can't do a lot with him. I feel like I can't force him too much. I can give him some side pressure, but that's about it. So I'm just gonna play him. Alright, got a net man. He's ready to go. I think we got this one clean.
A local kid who happened to have a net on him was able to bring my brown in, and I shared the glory with him.
All the time I spent on you, all the time I spent on you, but you keep me hanging on all day long. All the time I spent on you, all the time I spent on you.
After a few more weeks, I made my way back up to Erie for what I thought might be my last trip of the season. I stopped off at Walnut Creek as there wasn't many crowds, and I quickly hooked into a good fish. Although I lost this fight, it started the day off and got the action going. About a week before, some rains had come to the area and brought in some more fresh fish, and it was just good to see the numbers up in some of the heavier areas. I got back to the trusty bottleneck at 12 Mile Creek, where the fish were stacked up under the tube. It quickly set off one of the best sessions of the season.
First cast magic. Clean. Almost got his head up. Almost. Fighting this huge buck right here at 12 Mile. Maybe 15 minutes now. Fighting like by far the hardest Erie fight I've had. Man, look at that.
After that session on 12 Mile Creek, I decided to head to New York and check out some other spots. I scouted a lot of water in New York and ended up back on the Canada Way Creek some of my favorite water to fish. While drifting a Black Death up underneath the spot where I caught my first ever steelhead, I hooked into another chrome, and it gave me a good fight. It felt good to get a fish back at a spot that means so much to me and have so much memories. Further upstream, I dropped a nymph at one of the most popular spots on the river and was quickly hooked up into another aggressive fight, peeling drag. This fish really tested me and ended up pulling me down about 100 meters before I got it to net.
Big boy took me for a run. Started up there at the bridge. Eventually got me. Had to get him before he got into that faster water. Woo!
With a little daylight left, I headed back to Pennsylvania before hitting the road back home to Maggie Valley. After a dry few weeks, we got some much needed rain and snow up north, and I took the opportunity to head back for one more shot at some steelhead. The flows were absolutely ideal, and I finally had an opportunity to get away from some light tippet and got into some great fights. Using 4X tippet this time, I was able to actually control the fish a little bit more and actually tire them out, getting their head to the surface without having to rely on a 15 to 30 minute fight in order to bring them in. After some success on 12 Mile, I headed back to New York to see what the flows on the upper Canada Wave Creek looked like. The stream looked incredible, and I quickly got to work, hooking up with the steelhead at one of my favorite spots where I used to guide clients. I ended up losing that fight, and having to be back in the fly shop the next day, I decided to head back to PA before heading south through Ohio.
Ew, fishing green nutbag. Second person clean. Good fight.
I got into another fight back on the bottleneck at 12 Mile. After losing that fight, I decided to switch it up a bit. With the heavier flows, I broke out the streamer rod for the first time in the late season, moving back away from tight lining for a bit. This fight was fun. I was under control with the fish the whole time, even played with the drag a little bit too much, but ultimately I was able to bring this one in without much challenge at all.
I got this thing, I can get it straight up like that. There you go, look at that. First fish right here. Let's go.
With just a little sunlight left, I was able to squeak in one more hookup, and this was a great fish. Now, this time I was fishing on actually a synthetic egg sac that I put a size 10 fly hook through. I found out these egg sacs actually drift perfectly and they cast great on a Euro setup. The fish can't get enough of them, and I struggle to keep them. I quickly made my way over to Walnut Creek, hoping to get one more session before I would call it for the season. I was lucky to hook up with a beautiful brown that gave me a quick but pretty technical fight, to be honest. This fight and this fish would end the season for me, so with mixed emotions I looked down at the brown before I hit the road back to Maggie Valley to call it for the season. Looking back at this season, it was fantastic to get back up to water I used to guide and test out some of these Euro nymphing techniques we use in North Carolina on some steelhead up north. Now, I spent most of my time on 12-mile, 16-mile, and 20-mile creeks in Pennsylvania, as well as the Canada Way Creek in New York. There are plenty of other streams all the way from Cleveland to Buffalo that make up Steelhead Alley. If you've never had the opportunity to head up there yourself, I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful part of the country with endless wineries down to crystal clear blue water with pristine streams full of massive rainbow trout. Well, that's all for me out of the 2023 steelhead season. I look forward to seeing y'all next fall. Tight lines.